In the spring of 1952, a Bedouin shepherd climbed into a cave near the Dead Sea looking for lost sheep. What he found instead was a scroll unlike any other in history, not written on parchment or papyrus, but hammered into sheets of copper. When scholars finally cut it open 4 years later, they found something that made no sense: a detailed list of hiding places, 64 locations. In the spring of 1952, a Bedouin shepherd climbed into a cave near the Dead Sea looking for lost sheep. What he found instead, the question is whether it ever existed at all. Most people know about the Dead Sea Scrolls as religious texts, ancient manuscripts that changed how we read the Bible. But the copper scroll is different. It reads like a logistics document. It uses measurements. It gives directions. And if what it describes is real, we're talking about one of the largest treasure hoards in human history, hidden somewhere in the Judean wilderness 2,000 years ago. But here's what keeps scholars up at night: the language is strange, the locations are vague, and the entire thing might be a monumental exercise in misdirection. Some researchers believe it's a genuine inventory from the Second Temple period. Others think it's a folklore document, a myth written down as if it were fact. A few believe it's something even stranger, a coded map that we haven't yet learned how to read. What I want to do in this video is take you through the evidence the way an investigator would approach a cold case. We're going to look at the physical scroll itself, the context of its discovery, the attempts to decode it, and the competing theories about what it really is. We're going to examine why treasure hunters keep searching, why archaeologists remain skeptical, and what the latest research tells us about who might have written this thing and why. And by the end, you'll understand why the copper scroll is one of the most frustrating, tantalizing, and deeply weird artifacts ever pulled from the ground. The story begins in Cave 3 at Qumran, about a mile from the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. This is barren country, limestone cliffs, dust, heat that makes metal tools painful to touch. The caves here had already yielded parchment scrolls, fragments of biblical texts, and sectarian writings that scholars were starting to attribute to a Jewish community called the Essenes. But on March 14, 1952, when archaeologists entered Cave 3, they found 2 corroded rolls of metal lying near the back wall, partially buried in dirt and mineral deposits. At first, no one realized what they were looking at. The metal had oxidized into a greenish crust. The rolls were brittle. Trying to unroll them would have shattered the material. Here's the first strange thing. Copper was expensive in antiquity. The metal had oxidized into a greenish crust. The rolls were brittle. Trying to unroll them would have shattered the material. Here's the first strange thing. Copper was expensive in antiquity. Parchment and papyrus were the standard writing materials because they were cheaper and easier to work with. Writing on metal was reserved for. The scroll was eventually transported to Manchester, England, where a team at the College of Technology devised a way to cut it into strips using a small circular saw. The process took years. When they finally read the text in 1956, they found something no one had anticipated. The scroll lists 64 locations where treasure has been buried. Each entry follows a pattern, a place name, a set of directions, a description of what's hidden, and sometimes a depth or additional landmark. The quantities are staggering. One entry mentions 65 gold bars. Another describes vessels buried under a water channel. Each entry follows a pattern, a place name, a set of directions, a description of what's hidden, and sometimes a depth or additional landmark. The quantities are staggering. One entry mentions 65 gold bars. Many of them don't match any known locations in ancient Judea. The Hebrew is unusual, filled with Greek loanwords and spelling errors. And the directions are vague enough that even if you knew where to start, you'd have no way to pinpoint the exact spot. Let's pause here and consider what we're dealing with. If this is a genuine treasure list, who made it? And why? The most popular theory is that it's an inventory from the Second Temple in Jerusalem, hidden just before the Romans destroyed the city in 70 CE. The temple was the center of Jewish religious life, and it accumulated enormous wealth through tithes, donations, and offerings. When the Jewish revolt against Rome began in 66 CE, the temple authorities would have known the Romans were coming. Josephus, the Jewish historian who lived through the war, describes the Romans looting the temple and carrying off its treasures to Rome. But Josephus also mentions that some of the temple's wealth was hidden beforehand. Could the copper scroll be a record of those hiding places, written by priests or Levites who hoped to retrieve the treasure after the war ended? Here's where it gets complicated. The copper scroll was found at Qumran, which is about 15 miles from Jerusalem. Qumran is associated with the Essenes, a separatist Jewish sect that rejected the temple priesthood and lived in communal settlements. Why would a temple inventory end up in an Essene cave? The Essenes didn't participate in temple rituals. The scroll doesn't identify its authors. It doesn't explain the circumstances. It just lists locations and quantities. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a treasure hunter's dream, you're not alone. The scroll doesn't identify its authors. It doesn't explain the circumstances. It just lists locations and quantities. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a treasure hunter's dream, you're not alone. In the decades since the scroll was deciphered, multiple expeditions have tried to locate the treasure. Most of them have failed spectacularly. The issue is that the geographical references are maddening. Where is the Valley of Achor? There's a biblical reference to a place called Achor in the book of Joshua, but its exact location is disputed. Even if you could identify the valley, which ruin? There are dozens of ancient ruins in the region. What steps? How do you measure 40 cubits when you don't know the starting point? Some researchers have argued that the scroll uses coded language or symbolic geography, that the place names aren't meant to be taken literally, but are references to a mental map that only the scroll's authors would understand. This theory is supported by the fact that some entries include strange phrases that don't fit the pattern of a straightforward inventory. For instance, one entry mentions the vessel of resin of the high priest. Another refers to a duplicate copy of the scroll itself, supposedly buried in a cistern. These details suggest that the scroll might be more than a simple list. It might be a layered document that combines real locations with symbolic or religious meanings. There's another possibility that makes some scholars deeply uncomfortable. The copper scroll might be a work of folklore. In the late Second Temple period, there was a genre of Jewish literature focused on hidden treasures and lost sacred objects. These texts often described the hiding of the Ark of the Covenant, the tabernacle vessels, or other temple items, and they were meant to provide hope during times of oppression. The idea was that God's sacred objects were preserved somewhere, waiting for a future redemption. If the copper scroll belongs to this genre, then it's not a real inventory, it's a religious fantasy written down as if it were fact. The treasure never existed. The scroll is a symbol. But here's the problem with dismissing it as folklore. The copper scroll doesn't read like folklore. Folklore texts are usually written in elevated, literary Hebrew with theological flourishes. The treasure never existed. The scroll is a symbol. But here's the problem with dismissing it as folklore. The copper scroll doesn't read like folklore. It's tedious. It reads like someone made a list because they needed to keep track of something. That's what makes it so hard to categorize. If it's fiction, it's the most boring, convincing fiction ever written. It's tedious. It reads like someone made a list because they needed to keep track of something. That's what makes it so hard to categorize. If it's fiction, it's the most boring, convincing fiction ever written. Let me give you a specific example of how strange this document is. Entry number 12 reads, "At the mouth, pools were everywhere. Myrtle trees grew all over Judea." The description is specific enough to sound real, but vague enough to be useless. It's like someone giving you directions to a house by saying, "Turn left at the big tree, walk past the red building, and look under the rock." Unless you're already familiar with the area, you'll never find it. And that raises a disturbing question. Was the scroll ever meant to help anyone find the treasure? Or was it written deliberately to be unsolvable, a document meant to preserve the memory of what was hidden without revealing where? Now let's talk about the language, because this is where things get really interesting. The Hebrew in the copper scroll is unusual. It's closer to Mishnaic Hebrew, the language used in the Mishnah, which was compiled around 200 CE, then to the biblical Hebrew used in most of the other Dead Sea Scrolls. It includes Greek loanwords and Aramaicisms. The spelling is inconsistent. Some scholars argue that this reflects the scroll's late date, that it was written closer to the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130 CE rather than the first Jewish revolt in the 60s. Others think the strange language is evidence that the scroll was written by someone who wasn't a professional scribe, someone who spoke Hebrew but wasn't trained in formal literary composition. That could fit the theory of temple priests in a hurry, writing down vital information without worrying about grammar or style. There is also the question of why the scroll was written on copper in the first place. Copper doesn't decay the way parchment does, but it's harder to work with. You can't write on copper with ink. You have to engrave it. The letters on the copper scroll were punched into the metal using a chisel or stylus, probably by someone working quickly and under stress. The letter forms are irregular. Copper doesn't decay the way parchment does, but it's harder to work with. You can't write on copper with ink. You have to engrave it. The letters on the copper scroll were punched into the metal. It suggests crisis. And the most obvious crisis in first-century Judea was the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Josephus gives us a detailed account of what happened during the siege. The city was surrounded. It suggests crisis. And the most obvious crisis in first-century Judea was the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Josephus gives us a detailed account of what happened during the siege. The city was surrounded. Food ran out. Factions fought each other inside the walls. The temple was set on fire. But Josephus also mentions that some wealth was concealed beforehand. He writes about priests who buried sacred items and about caches found years later by treasure hunters. If you were a temple official in the spring of 70 CE, watching the Roman army close in, what would you do? You'd take the most valuable and sacred objects, hide them in locations only you and a few trusted colleagues knew about, and write down the locations in case you didn't survive. That's the theory that drives most serious attempts to find the treasure. The problem is, even if the theory is correct, the Romans controlled the region after 70 CE. They would have interrogated survivors. They would have searched for hidden wealth. It's possible that the treasure was found and melted down within a few years of being buried. Or it's possible that the people who knew the real locations died before they could retrieve anything, and the copper scroll is all that's left, a map with no one to read it. There's a scholar named Bargil Pixner who proposed a different theory in the 1990s. Pixner was a Benedictine monk and archaeologist who spent decades working in Jerusalem. He argued that the copper scroll was written by a group of Essenes who had reconciled with the temple priesthood during the revolt and were entrusted with safeguarding temple treasures. According to Pixner, the Essenes brought the treasures to Qumran and other locations in the wilderness, then wrote the copper scroll as a record. Pixner even led excavations based on his interpretation of the scroll's clues. Focusing on cisterns and caves around Qumran, He found ancient structures, pottery, and coins, but no treasure. His work is controversial. Some archaeologists respect his methodology. Others think he was reading too much into the text. Another researcher, John Marco Allegro, became obsessed with the copper scroll in the 1960s. Allegro was part of the original team of scholars working on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he became convinced that the treasure was real. He organized an expedition to Jordan in 1960, digging at sites he believed matched the scroll's descriptions. He found nothing. His methods were criticized, and he eventually fell out with the academic community over his increasingly radical theories about early Christianity. But Allegro's obsession illustrates something important. The copper scroll has a way of getting under people's skin. It's maddeningly specific and completely opaque at the same time. Let's shift perspective for a moment and think about what it would mean if the treasure is real and still out there. We're talking about artifacts from the Second Temple, objects that would rewrite our understanding of Jewish material culture in the first century. Temple vessels, incense shovels, priestly garments, tithes in the form of precious metals. These would be priceless, not just economically, but historically. They would provide physical evidence for practices described in biblical and rabbinic texts. They would be the archaeological find of the century. But here's the catch. Even if you found them, how would you prove they came from the temple? Unless there's an inscription or some unique identifying feature, a gold bar is just a gold bar. You'd need context, provenance, and a clear chain of evidence linking the objects to the scroll's descriptions. There's also the ethical and legal dimension. The locations described in the Copper Scroll are in the West Bank, Jordan, and Israel. These are politically sensitive areas. Any excavation would require permits, international cooperation, and a framework for deciding who owns what's found. The Jordanian government has strict laws about treasure hunting. The Israeli Antiquities Authority controls all archaeological work in Israeli territory, and many of the sites are located in areas where digging would be physically dangerous or politically impossible. So even if someone decoded the scroll tomorrow, they couldn't just grab a shovel and start digging. Now, there's a detail in the scroll that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's one of the strangest parts of the whole mystery. Entry number 64, the final entry, doesn't describe treasure. Instead it says, "In the pit adjoining on the north, in a hole opening northwards, and buried at its mouth." A copy of this document, with an explanation and their measurements, and an inventory of each thing and other things. Think about that for a second. The scroll is telling you that there's another scroll buried somewhere, and that second scroll contains an explanation of the first. This is either brilliant misdirection or the cruelest clue in archaeological history. Generations of scholars have debated what this means. Does a second scroll actually exist? If so, where is the pit? What is the explanation? Is it a key to decoding the place names, or is it just more of the same vague directions? Some researchers think the reference to a duplicate scroll is a scribal convention, a way of saying that this information exists in multiple copies to ensure it survives. Others think it's a literal statement, that there was a second, more detailed document that was buried separately, perhaps in a more secure location. If that's true, and if anyone ever found it, we'd finally have the answers. But no second scroll has ever been discovered, and without it, we're stuck trying to solve a puzzle that might be missing half its pieces. There's a more radical interpretation that's been proposed by a few scholars who specialize in ancient Jewish mysticism. They argue that the Copper Scroll is a Kabbalistic text, that the place names and measurements are symbolic rather than literal, and that the treasure represents hidden spiritual knowledge rather than physical wealth. According to this view, the scroll is a map to enlightenment, not to gold. The duplicate copy would then be the inner meaning, accessible only to those who understand the code. This theory is not taken seriously by mainstream archaeologists, but it highlights how open to interpretation the scroll really is. When a text is this ambiguous, it becomes a kind of mirror. People see in it what they want to see. Let me bring in another layer of complexity. In 2007, a team of researchers used advanced imaging techniques to re-examine the copper scroll's text. They found traces of ink on the metal, suggesting that the engraver may have first sketched the letters in ink before punching them in. This changes our understanding of how the scroll was made. It suggests a two-stage process: composition, then engraving. That would give the authors time to think, to revise, to decide exactly what to include. It makes the scroll feel less like a desperate last-minute record and more like a carefully planned document. But it also raises new questions. If they had time to plan, why is the language so rough? Why are there spelling errors? Why do some entries seem incomplete? One possibility is that the scroll was compiled from multiple sources. Imagine a scenario where different groups, priests, Levites, temple administrators, each had responsibility for hiding portions of the treasure. Each group wrote down their own locations, and then someone collected all those notes and copied them onto copper. That would explain the inconsistencies in style and the variations in how entries are phrased. It would also mean that no single person knew all the locations, a security measure to prevent betrayal or torture from revealing everything. If that's true, then the scroll was always meant to be read by multiple people working together, and trying to decode it alone is futile. There's a researcher named Robert Feather who published a book in the early 2000s arguing that the copper scroll has connections to ancient Egypt. Feather noticed that some of the place names and terms in the scroll resemble Egyptian words and locations, and he proposed that the treasure originally came from Akhenaten's reign in Egypt and was brought to Judea centuries later. This theory is extremely controversial and not widely accepted, but it shows how far people will go to make sense of the scroll. When the conventional explanations don't work, scholars start looking for unconventional answers. Let's talk about what happens when people actually try to dig. In 1988, a team led by an archaeologist named Vendell Jones excavated near Qumran based on his interpretation of the copper scroll. Jones claimed he found anointing oil and incense in jars buried in a cave. He argued that these substances matched descriptions in the scroll and were part of the temple's ritual supplies. The Israeli press covered the find enthusiastically, but when the materials were analyzed, the results were inconclusive. Some chemists said the residues could be ancient perfumes. Others said they were natural mineral deposits. Jones never found gold or silver. He never found temple vessels. He spent the rest of his life convinced he was on the right track, and he died in 2010 without making the discovery he hoped for. Jones is just one example. There are amateur treasure hunters, religious groups, and even academic teams who've tried to crack the copper scroll over the years. None of them have succeeded. And that brings up a painful question. At what point do you stop looking? How many failed expeditions does it take before you conclude that the treasure either doesn't exist or is so well hidden that it might as well not exist? For archaeologists, the answer is usually stop now. Archaeology is about understanding the past through systematic excavation, not about chasing treasure. But for believers, the scroll is a test of faith. It's a challenge that demands an answer. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The copper scroll is physically damaged. Portions of the text are missing or illegible due to corrosion. The edges of some strips are crumbled away. There are gaps in the entries, places where we can't read the full description. This means that even if the scroll was originally a complete and accurate list, we don't have access to all the information anymore. We're working from a corrupted file. Any attempt to use the scroll as a guide has to account for the fact that key details might be lost forever. And that makes the whole enterprise feel even more hopeless. Yet, people keep trying. In 2006, a British filmmaker named Shelley Waxman worked with Israeli archaeologists to investigate several sites mentioned in Copper Scroll research. They used ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and drone surveys. They found anomalies, subsurface voids, metal traces. But when they excavated, they found modern debris, Roman-era pottery, nothing that matched the scroll's descriptions. Waxman concluded that the scroll might be a fantasy document, a literary creation meant to inspire hope rather than guide recovery. But even he admitted that he couldn't be certain. The evidence is just too fragmentary. There's a theological dimension to this that's worth considering. For Jews in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the destruction of the temple was a catastrophe. It wasn't just a political or military defeat, it was a spiritual crisis. The temple was where God's presence dwelled on earth. Sacrifices could only be offered there. Pilgrimages were central to religious life. When the Romans burned it down, it felt like the end of the world. In that context, the idea that temple treasures were preserved somewhere, waiting to be found, wasn't just about money. It was about continuity. It was about the belief that God's covenant with Israel was still intact, that the sacred objects would one day return to their rightful place. The Copper Scroll, whether real or symbolic, functions as a promise. Now, let's consider a darker possibility. What if the scroll was never meant to be found? What if it was written as a decoy, a false trail to mislead the Romans or rival Jewish factions? Ancient history is full of examples of misdirection during wartime. If the temple authorities knew they were going to be interrogated, they might have created a fake inventory with nonsense locations to protect the real hiding places. The Copper Scroll could be the ancient equivalent of disinformation. If that's true, then every treasure hunter who's ever followed its clues has been chasing a ghost. But here's the thing, even if the treasure is a myth, the scroll is real. It exists. You can see it today in the Jordan Museum in Amman. The metal is still there, green with age, covered in ancient Hebrew letters. Someone made it. Someone chose copper. Someone engraved the text. Someone placed it in that cave. Those actions were real. The labor was real. The intent was real. So even if we never find a single gold coin, the Copper Scroll tells us something important about the people who created it, about their fears, their hopes, their understanding of value and survival. I want to bring in one more expert perspective, Hanan Eshel, an Israeli archaeologist who passed away in 2010, spent years studying the Copper Scroll. Eshel argued that the scroll was written by Essenes who had access to temple traditions through family connections or shared rituals. He pointed out that some of the place names in the scroll appear in other Dead Sea texts, which suggests a common geographic knowledge. Eshel believed the treasure was real, but acknowledged that the chances of finding it were close to zero. He said, in an interview shortly before his death, that the value of the scroll isn't in what it might lead to, but in what it reveals about a community in crisis, trying to preserve what mattered most to them. That's a perspective worth sitting with. Maybe the point of the Copper Scroll isn't to find treasure. Maybe the point is to understand why someone felt it was necessary to write this down, to commit it to imperishable metal, to hide it in a cave, and hope that future generations would understand. That act, writing, hiding, hoping, is itself a kind of time capsule. It captures a moment of desperation and faith. It says, we were here, we had something precious, we tried to save it. So where does that leave us? After 70 years of research, translation, excavation, and debate, we still don't know if the Copper Scroll is a genuine inventory, a symbolic text, a work of folklore, or a piece of ancient disinformation. We don't know if the treasure exists or if it was looted 2,000 years ago. We don't know who wrote it or why they chose the specific places they described. We have theories, educated guesses, and passionate arguments, but we don't have proof. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Copper Scroll. It's a reminder that history is full of gaps, that the past doesn't always give up its secrets, and that sometimes the most important artifacts are the ones that refuse to be understood. It challenges our assumptions about evidence and certainty. It forces us to admit that there are questions we can't answer, no matter how advanced our technology or how thorough our research. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. Do you think the treasure is real? Do you think it's been found already and kept secret? Or do you think the whole thing is a symbolic text that we're misreading? Drop your theory in the comments. And if you want to see more deep dives into ancient mysteries that don't have easy answers, make sure you're subscribed. There's a lot more where this came from. The copper scroll sits in its museum case, silent and unreadable to anyone who doesn't study ancient Hebrew. Tourists walk past it every day. Some stop and read the placard. Most move on quickly, drawn to more visually impressive artifacts. But for those who know the story, who understand what that corroded metal represents, it's one of the most powerful objects in the world. Not because of what it might lead to, but because of what it refuses to give up. In the end, the copper scroll is less about treasure and more about the human need to preserve, to remember, to believe that something sacred can survive disaster. Whether the gold is out there or not, that impulse, the drive to write it down, to hide it, to hope, that's the real inheritance. And it's one we're still living with today, every time we try to protect what we can't afford to lose. The treasure may be gone, the mystery remains. And in a strange way, that might be exactly as it was meant to be.